Hello, and welcome to part 3 of my Finish Your Novel series, where I, L.L. Smith, give you advice on how to push through that novel. A lot of the trouble of writing is just writing. Once you get that finished project and that feeling of accomplishment, that can propel you into an entire career of writing. But if you never break that wall, if you never finish that first, then you wallow with the thousands, if not millions of people who have started something and never finished it. So with that said, let's move on to part 2. In part 2, we're going to start talking about the actual writing process, the physical writing process, writing your novel. In the first part, we mainly went over outlining, finding the idea, where ideas come from, how to turn an idea into a story, so on and so forth. And now I'm going to focus on the actual writing process. So, putting content to paper, as I like to call it, we're going to focus on the snags of that process because there's going to be a lot. So, first and foremost, just the general snag of a lack of motivation, lack of content, not being able to actually write the story for whatever reason. If you get stuck in your story, there's any number of reasons as to why you are stuck and why you cannot finish it. The biggest ones that I have found is either a lack of interest in the current content or a lack of planning, which I plan my novels way in advance. So a lack of planning isn't so common with me, but it is a common one with most people. So you get the lack of planning, you get the lack of interest, or you just generally get stuck, which most people would call writer's block. And there's ways around all of those things, really. So, starting with a lack of interest, and this is one that I have a lot of personal experience with. I hate writing scenes where people are traveling from point A to point B, and I hate it to the point to where I obligate myself to write at least 30 minutes a day, regardless of what's going on in my life or anything. I'm going to write 30 minutes a day on whatever my current project is, and that gets me through a lot. But on most days, if I'm in the middle of a scene that excites me, that I am having fun writing, I can write that entire scene, which might be 10 pages, in an hour. Or if I'm writing a scene where characters traveling from point A to point B, I might write a paragraph in 30 minutes. So it's drastically different when you are feeling the content, when you're passionately interested in the content, and when you're getting there. Writing something that you're not passionate about creates really twofold problem. A, you're not going to want to write it because you're not feeling it. And B, most people probably aren't going to want to read it because what you're writing is crap. So you got to find a way to like it. You got to find a way to make it fun for you and in exchange make it fun for your audience. And then, of course, that's how you're going to push through it. Me personally, as I've already mentioned, I hate traveling. I hate traveling scenes. I despise them. How did I fix that? My third upcoming novel is a travelogue. I wrote an entire novel about traveling so that I could overcome my fear of writing traveling scenes. So I took a scene from books in general that I hate writing, wrote an entire book about it, so that when I run into that scene in the next book I write, I can find a way to enjoy it. And that's been huge. It's a small, well, in terms of what I write, it's a small book. It's like 81,000 words. But still, it's an 81,000 word novel, full-length novel, that is a travelogue built just so that I can cure my own hatred of writing travel scenes. And I will say that it worked. It's a very extreme example. I mean, if you hate if you hate writing action scenes, I don't advise that you write a entire novel of nothing but action so that you can get over that hatred. But I mean, if you're up to the task, I suggest you give it a go. Maybe a short story instead of a full-length novel, and you'll find ways to make that interesting because that's what your whole story revolves around at that point. It has to be interesting. So that is one very extreme way that I have used to get around the idea of the mundane scenes or the scenes that I am just not feeling. Something that some people are perfectly fine with is just crank and write on through it. As I mentioned before, I mandate myself to write 30 minutes a day, regardless of what's going on in my personal life. And maybe that's all you need. You need that mandation, you need that force, and you'll get through that scene. Gosh darn it, it'll be hard as heck, and it might take you a week, but you got through it. And that's fine too, as long as the content is worth reading. Don't just write he walked over there and now he's in the place that he needs to be because that's lazy and people see that. So just make sure that if you're forcing yourself through it, you're not forcing yourself through it in a way that produces crap, because no one likes crap. So that's kind of the biggest thing when you're trying to overcome that lack of motivation. When you run into that wall and you're like, I'm just not feeling right in the content. The plan is there because you've plotted out ahead of time, but you're just not feeling like writing what you need, what you know needs to be written. That's a pretty common one. I already touched base on planning, but we'll go back to that because even though I do plan, there are times where I run into a situation where I don't know what to write next. Usually, what happens is, say, chapter 7, the robots were supposed to drill into the moon. I decided that the robots drilled into the moon, chapter 7. That took me 2 pages to write. 2 pages is a kind of short chapter, especially if it's like really to the point. Like literally, the robots, they went and bought a drill at the Home Depot, and then now they're gonna drill into the moon, and boom, we're done. So that creates an uninteresting chapter, a really short chapter, and just a whole lot of different kind of hangups. So if that's something you're running into, where you've got your outline, you're writing your chapters out, but you're just very simply saying what happens in this chapter is what's going to happen, and then you move on to the next thing. Well, you're not only going to create a really short story doing that, but it probably will lack a lot of depth as well. So what I do when I run into situations like that is that's where I dive into my characters. How can I use my characters and their unique situations and their unique personalities to try and draw more out of this scene? So I've got robots on the moon for this story that we're going with. Maybe the robots on the moon go to Home Depot and they've got like 1,000 different coupons and they're trying to price match, but they get interrupted because there's a shoplifter and then they've got to get involved with that. And when they come back to the cashiers, then they're going back to their coupon situation. And then boom, I just dragged a scene about robots drilling into the moon from 2 pages to possibly 10 or 12. And I feel like that's a very effective strategy because it gives the audience more of a look into your characters. Character-driven stories kind of rule fiction. Characters really kind of rule fiction. You can write, I'm not going to say a crap story, but you can write a lesser story with amazing characters and get away with it, but you can't write an amazing story with lesser characters and get away with it. I shouldn't say you can't, because I'm sure there's people out there who are okay with that, but for the most part, characters trump everything. If you're using your characters and their unique dispositions or personalities or whatever to expand on a relatively simple concept, that's almost always a win and almost always a good place to go. So if that's the trouble you're running into, use your characters, use their personalities, bring out the best in them. Let's talk a moment on endings, because endings is a very important part of the book. It sucks to say it, because the ending could be the last 10% of your book, but it's the most remembered percent of your book, and it's going to make or break the other 90% of your book that happens before it. And it is really unfortunate that that is what happens, but that is ultimately why people pick up your book. Like, they pick up your book, they get hooked on your characters, and they've got to see how this journey ends. That craving to see the ending is what carries them from chapter 1 all the way to the finish. So if you get to the finish line and the finish line explodes, people aren't going to like that. People want to see a finish. It needs to be clear. It needs to be concise. I mean, you can have some vague kind of wonderful stuff, but you don't want to be too mushy-gushy with your ending either, to where there's really no answers. I watch a lot of Brandon Sanderson's teachings on YouTube. He talks a lot about promises. And at the beginning of your story, you make promises to the reader that you need to make good on towards the end. And that's a pretty good way to look at it. If you promise your reader that the robots are going to live on the moon at the beginning of this story, and by the end of the story we don't know whether or not the robots can live on the moon, then we wrote a pretty poor ending. Like, good and bad endings are subjective at the end of the day, but honestly, most people aren't going to enjoy that ending if you're just like, well, yeah, this book's going to be about whether or not the robots can live on the moon. At the end of the book, we still don't know if they can live on the moon. Boom, that's it. People will argue that that's okay if you're writing a series, but every book in your series should really be able to stand alone as its own book. You don't want to cling to the idea of, oh well, that's going to come in book 2 and that's going to come in book 2, because if they didn't love book 1, they're not coming back for book 2. That's just reality. So we got to make sure that we're really doing what we can to make that ending concise, and having a little bit of that kind of cliffhanger edge ending, that's fine too. You don't need to answer all of your questions. Say you start your novel and you set up 7 promises instead of just the one, and you answer 4 and leave 3 kind of wishy-washy. You can get away with that because you gave your audience at least a majority of the tied up loose ends that they were looking for. You gave them at least a majority of their promises. Some people, I mean, everyone's different. Some people won't like that because they want every answer, and some people will love it because you give them just enough, and some people will hate it. Some people will love it. That's just writing, and you can't appease everybody. You've got to at least appease yourself and stay true to the story that you want to write. If you want to write the story where none of those questions are answered, none of those promises come to fruition, you can write that story. It's absolutely your right to write that story. Just know that it's not going to be a well-received ending, because that's just, it's not going to meet the expectations of a reader. It's not why most readers don't read a story to get nothing out of an ending. So it's very important. It's also important to factor in the length. You don't want an ending that goes on and on and on forever. You also don't want an ending that is too short and too sweet. Built up this entire scene. This is what you've built up to. This is what 90% of your book was building up to. And if it closes in 2 pages, that better be like the best written 2 pages that you have ever produced, because otherwise there's a problem. Likewise, 90% of your book builds up to this moment and it takes 30 pages to get to the end. People are going to start wondering, like, what in the world's going on? Unless, of course, maybe your average chapter length is 30 pages, then okay. But just keep that in mind. You don't want to, it's a very fine kind of middle ground that you want to get to. You don't want to write too much into the ending. You don't want to write too little in the ending. You definitely don't want to write too little into it. I would say lean towards too much, but definitely try and find that happy medium. That about concludes the writing process and the different kind of hang-ups that I have and how I can get around them. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on part 3.